Well, hello there, good people of the world and fellow outdoors people. It's the Big Heavy here, coming at you with 10 tips for taking your children hiking or backpacking. And if you're watching this video, I probably don't need to tell you about all the benefits of getting your kids outdoors, but I've had my 3 kids who are now 13, 10, and 7 outdoors on backpacking adventures, hiking, bicycle camping, general car camping, all sorts of things. And I think it's really been a boon to their personal development. I think getting your kids outside, makes them more resilient. They're more capable with dealing with whatever strange things life throws at them, whether that's cold or rain or being a little bit exhausted. It helps them build, goal setting, seeing a giant mountain and knowing that they're going to climb up it, and then ultimately being able to be on the summit and look down and see what they accomplished. And it builds a general respect for the outdoor world. There's all sorts of stuff now about climate change and taking care of our planet and all that stuff, and I know that's a bit of a loaded political topic these days, but if nothing else, getting your kids outside shows them why some of this stuff that everyone's hotly debating is worth protecting and worth taking care of. So I want to give you 10 tips, and I will actually give you 10 despite my janky pinky finger that doesn't quite work. I'm not going to give you 9.5. And the first 8-ish of those tips are general, logistical, mindset, all that sort of thing about taking your kids out on a hiking or backpacking trip. And then the last few tips are more gear oriented. So the first tip, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that may be some good general life advice. I think it's particularly applicable to getting your kids in the outdoors. And what I mean by that is if you have the opportunity, even right now, to turn off YouTube, grab one of your kiddos and go for a walk in the local park or greenway, or even in that little trail that's in your backyard, I think that's way better than planning this elaborate, perfect expedition. If you extend that tip outwards, I think as your kids grow older, I'd rather see you take them on a dozen trips that are maybe half an hour or so from where you live. Maybe they're not the most elaborate things. Again, maybe they're involving local greenways or a bit of an elaborate hike in a local park or something like that. Better to do that than over the course of that 10 years have barely planned, that one spectacular trip to that amazing national park where you've got to, save money and get gear and do all this preparatory stuff. I think in almost all cases, a decent and maybe imperfect walk in the woods today is much better than that, elaborate family trip to Yellowstone that may or may not happen in 10 years. Tip number 2 is something that seems like it should be fairly obvious, but it's frankly something that I struggled a little bit with, particularly with my oldest child, who was the first one that I started taking into the outdoors and taking on some backpacking trips with me. And that's make sure that the trip is about them and not about you. I made the mistake initially of thinking, hey, it's going to be great. I'm going to have other people that I can bring on my adventures, and it's going to be awesome. And the flaw with that thinking was I was thinking in terms of I was going to plan an adventure that was interesting, exciting, challenging, all that stuff for me, and then, drag one of the kids along and hope that they were able to kind of keep up and enjoy the same things that I would enjoy. And that was the wrong way to approach particularly something like hiking or backpacking. You want to really focus on getting yourself into a childlike mindset as much as you can. And if you do that, when you go out and you've got this amazing backpacking trip planned, you've got all the right gear, the weather's perfect, all that stuff, and 15 steps into the hike, your son or daughter looks down and says, hey, this is the most amazing bug or fern or rock or whatever that I've ever seen. If you're in that correct headspace and you're thinking about this trip from your child's eyes, you're going to hopefully, get down there with them and look at that rock and, poke at that bug, even if it's, a bug that there's 5 billion of that you're going to see over the course of your trip, or it's, a fern that's the most common bit of fauna in your local area. If you're in that, hey, this is my trip and I'm dragging the kids along with me mindset, you're going to be sitting there tapping your feet. You're going to have about 4 seconds before you're ready to explode because, you've barely got your heart moving and already your kids are stopping and looking at stuff. So make sure that you approach everything from the planning to the route you're picking to the actual execution of your hike or backpacking trip with making this all about your kids. And that may sound like maybe you're putting your own needs, wants, and desires on hold. Maybe you're sitting there saying, hey, I don't know if, for the next 18 years I can sort of put the things I like to do in the back burner and, go out and poke at bugs and play with rocks. But there's two kind of neat aspects to getting in that mindset. The first is, if you're a mid 40-year-old human like I am, you don't get a lot of chances to put yourself in the headspace of a 5 or 6-year-old. And it's a pretty interesting way to see the world, and it can be a lot of fun. The second thing that's cool is you go from being one of a member of a team to being kind of the guide and the teacher. Maybe I'm over-indexing on this, but maybe you can even think of yourself as sort of a sage or something. But you're teaching your children about something that's presumably meaningful, important, impactful for you, and you can turn all these little moments into moments where you get to share that knowledge. If you stop for a snack break, you can explain to your children why your raincoat is at the top of your pack. Or if you look at some little bug, you guys can see where it's scurrying around and talk about, why is it going under that log versus, sitting out in the middle of that path. In most cases, at least with my own kids that I've experienced, they look up to that knowledge and they're interested in learning from an adult. I think humans are naturally wired to kind of learn from our elders and to respect the skills that our elders have. And this is your chance to impart some of that wisdom. And I've had a lot of conversations with all three of my kids at various times where they'll say, oh, how did you know that? Or, where did you learn these things? And that's so cool that you're teaching me this. And a lot of times, after we talk through whatever we're talking about, I'll say, some of these things I had to learn myself, and now you're, 7 or 10 or 13 or whatever. I'm able to pass this knowledge on to you. Imagine how much better you'll be at being an outdoors person than I was when I was your age. That's pretty cool. It's kind of neat to be in this position where you're able to create future generations of outdoors people and see that you can make them a better outdoorsman or outdoorswoman than you ever could be. And to get mentally prepared for that, right at the planning stages, I'll put myself in, or try and put myself in my kids' headspace and think about, is this too difficult? Are we going to see some interesting things? Am I exposing them to a challenge that's appropriate for their age and appropriate for their ability? Or am I trying to do something that I think is super cool and dragging them along? And the good news is, kids are resilient. I've made this error several times, particularly with my oldest, taking him on stuff that was probably too hard or whatnot. And he's not scarred for life or anything like that. But the more you can get yourself in that kid's headspace and that headspace of being a teacher and a guide, I think the more fun you'll have, and ultimately the more enjoyable the hike will be for both of you. So tip number 3 is rather appropriately to follow what I call the rule of threes. And this is pretty simple. Whatever amount of distance you think is appropriate on your trip, divide that by 3 to get the correct answer. However long you think a day or your overall trip is going to take you, multiply that by 3. And then finally, whatever volume or amount of snacks you think is appropriate for you and your kids, multiply that sucker by 3. And that should get you to probably about the right place in terms of distance, time it's going to take you, and amount of snacks you're going to need to be successful on your adventure. Tip number 4, and this goes back a little bit to the being in the right headspace on having an adventure with your kids, is join them in their antics. In my case, being a mid 40-year-old dude that some might call portly, I prefer to use the term stately. I don't get to go and poke at bugs or skip rocks or jump in a random river as often as probably I should. So when you have your kids with you, and even if you're behind, even if you're going to miss your arrival in camp by 5 hours or whatever, and your kid sees a little river next to you and says, hey, let's take off our boots and go see how cold it is, join them in their antics. If they want to go and skip some rocks, if they want to do something that maybe probably might not be the exact perfect thing to do, like jump in a lake with most of their clothing on, if it's not going to create a risk to life and limb, then not only do I believe you should let them do that, but you should join in too. Some of my fondest memories from hiking and backpacking with my kids are around those types of activities. It's jumping in that river that we probably shouldn't have if we wanted to maintain our schedule. It's spending 20 minutes skipping rocks and remembering how much fun that is. Or it's coming home with a backpack where the water bottle pouch has like 8 rocks in them, and seeing how excited the kids are that they saved these rocks, and telling my wife the story about where they found each rock and why it was cool and all that sort of thing. Similarly, if the going gets tough, if your kid's getting a little cranky, sometimes even I as an adult get a little cranky, employ some kid-friendly tactics to get things back on track. I've dug up from my memory banks all sorts of camp songs, and I'll teach the kids some ridiculous song from when I was a kid and going to camp, and we'll spend hours singing that. I've probably spent multiple dozens of hours playing I'm Thinking of a Number to take our mind off of a day where it's rainy or a day where there's a lot of bugs out or something like that. My youngest, when we're hiking, he'll ask all sorts of ridiculous questions like, would you rather be a ladybug or a dung beetle or something like that? And we'll have these long, elaborate debates about what the the proper bug is that you should be in a particular environment. So join in the fun, and don't feel bad about launching some of that fun, whether it's singing some goofy song from your childhood, or telling some elaborate made-up ghost story or something like that. Tip 5, I think one of the secret weapons of hiking or backpacking with your kids is the power of snacks. Kids, particularly when they're a little bit younger, they exemplify the old hangry term, where they run a little low on fuel and they're getting grumpy, they're not moving as fast, and just generally whiny and complainy. If you sense a little bit of that, that's when I'll stop and have a bit of a snack break. And in terms of the snacks that I bring, try and make it fun, try and make it something that's special to being out in the outdoors. On one level, I'll let them pick some usually ridiculous snack at the grocery store, as long as it's not something that's going to be super melty. And usually it's chocolatey, processed, terrible stuff that we generally don't have around the house. But since we're going backpacking and we're going to be needing a lot of calories anyway, I'll let them grab that. And then we'll grab some stuff that's unique or special to camping or backpacking or whatnot. So things like packets of hot chocolate that we usually won't have at home. If we're on a backpacking trip, I'll usually bring oatmeal, and we'll add some nuts or dried fruit or something to that. And it goes from being oatmeal, which I generally don't like, to what we call camping oatmeal, and we heat that up, and that's kind of a big deal. We have all sorts of fun with the classic gorp that you can make yourself, which is good old raisins and peanuts. I told them about how if you add candy to it, it suddenly becomes crap. Candy, raisins, and peanuts, and they thought that was the funniest thing ever. And we'll spend a whole bunch of time making elaborate acronyms that usually involve poop or farts or something like that, but are some combination of, or some variation of, trail mix. So have some fun with the snacks that you choose, with the snacks that you bring. Maybe make some homemade gorp or whatever, and have everyone join in the fun of that. And then when you're out on the trail, if things are getting a little dark or people are getting a little grumpy, deploy the snacks. Don't be weirded out if your kid wants a chocolate bar for breakfast or whatever. I'll usually kind of let them go after that, under the assumption that somewhere deep inside their body knows what it needs, and it makes things a little fun, and there's nothing wrong with having some fun along the way. Now, in terms of tip number 6, safety precautions. Some of these are basic things that you should do if you're hiking with a group of adults or hiking solo, and that's things like leaving your route, your start point, your end point, and your rough schedule with what I'll call my home base. For me, that's my wife, or if the whole family's going out, we'll generally leave all that stuff with both of our parents, so neither of the in-laws feels like they're being excluded or anything like that. I'll also leave any potential detours or general areas I might be if people don't hear from me. And that's just good common sense for going out in the woods. In terms of kids-specific considerations related to safety, there's kind of 2 big areas that I like to think about. So the first is first aid. I generally always try and hike with some sort of first aid kit. When I'm out with my kids, I'll make sure I have enough, and maybe a few extra band-aids, Neosporin, little big band-aids, and gauze and stuff like that, since probably the most typical injuries you're going to come across is a little trip and fall, a little scrape, something like that. So having enough of that stuff is good. I also make sure that I have a little bit of moleskin in case somebody gets a blister, or at least I have some sort of thing where I can pierce that blister. That might be a knife, or it might be some tiny little scissors or snips or something like that. And I'll also make sure I have some sort of tummy medicine and aspirin that I can divide into an appropriately kid-sized dose. For myself, I learned pretty early on the power of having something like some Tums or some Pepto or Imodium or whatever. If you're out on a backpacking trip, you're probably going to be encountering some funky food that maybe your system's not used to, and there's nothing worse than getting a little bit of the runs while you're out on that sort of adventure. So having some sort of tummy/anti-diarrheal thing is good, and making sure you have something that you can size appropriately for your kids is good. In terms of trail safety, I pretty much always will have my kids lead the group, so I'm falling behind. That obviously lets me keep an eye on them. It makes sure that I'm going at their pace. In general, the recommendation I would give is have the slowest or kind of weakest member of your party out in front. For the most part, that's going to be your kids, although, with my 13-year-old, that may be changing fairly soon. And every hike we go on, we talk about the rules of the trail. And this is essentially, for me, preventing somebody from getting lost, wandering off, all that. The primary rule is every now and then, turn around, make sure you can see Dad. I'm speaking about me here, obviously. If you're not a dad, then change that accordingly. But make sure you can see Dad, and if you can't, immediately stop and sit down. That's probably the most important. Most people that get lost on a trail, it's almost invariably, they felt like they were lost, and then they started wandering somewhere, and before you know it, they went from being, maybe a little bit sort of displaced to being completely lost. So I always emphasize, if you can't see Dad, you stop and you sit down on your butt. Next, you count for 10 Mississippis. If you still don't see Dad, you sort of do a little yelling, hey Dad, where are you? Hey, I'm over here. Wait for another 10 Mississippis and then deploy the whistle. Most of the backpacks these days will have a little whistle on their strap. You can see this one here on the sternum strap, and this is pretty typical, has this little whistle thing on here. They're pretty loud and pretty high pitched, so they actually are quite effective. If you have a backpack that doesn't have one of those, I would get a little orange safety whistle. If your kid's not going to be carrying a backpack for some reason, maybe get them a little necklace with an orange safety whistle. If the yelling, wait 10 seconds doesn't work, the whistling, wait 10 seconds doesn't work, then for my oldest, who's now 13, I tell him if he's on the trail, maybe backtrack for 10, 15 seconds, assuming that, I fell down somewhere or busted myself or whatnot, see if you can find me. For my younger kids, I tell them, at that point, stop, have a little drink of water, open up your pack, have a snack. I make sure in all their individual packs, they have water, they have snacks, and they have at least a couple or 3 layers they can put on. So I tell them that if they do somehow get separated and nobody is able to find them in the first minute or so, they've got all the stuff they need to chill out there, and they just want to make sure they stay in that same spot and either wait for Dad, if a person they don't know comes by, explain what happened, tell them they can't find their dad, ask that person if they can help them, or ultimately maybe they might have to be there for the night. They'll be safe, they have the stuff, and ultimately mom, dad, or somebody is going to get them and get them out of the woods. I'd even suggest practicing this. I do this with all my kids. At some point during the hike, I'll kind of slow down and walk at a low pace when we're going around a curve or something like that, assuming I'm on a trail that's pretty easy to follow. And once they're out of sight, I'll count 10 seconds or so and make sure that when I round that corner, they're sitting there. And the first few times, they'll forget, they'll keep going or whatever, and they're just kids, so don't beat them up over it. But do that enough so that they eventually kind of understand, hey, number one, I need to check and make sure I can see Dad every now and then. Number two, if I don't see Dad, I sit my butt down, I wait, I do that yelling and whistling sequence, and that'll get them pretty well trained and prevent them from becoming lost, hopefully. The final, I guess it's sort of safety related thing. Even if you're going ultralight, pack a little bit of toilet paper, even pack a half dozen napkins that you can grab at a restaurant or something, because no matter how many times you tell your kids, you could be on a mountain or you could be near some area where there's, beautiful commodes made of gold that are sparkling clean. Your child, of course, will not need to use the bathroom then. And 2 hours later, when you're in the absolute middle of nowhere, there's no tree cover, you're on an exposed cliff face, that is when they will need to poop, and they will need to do that immediately. So if nothing else, having something to wipe them up and help them get a little cleaned up is always a good idea. Final safety tip, I generally always carry a Garmin InReach. I have one of the little super small guys. I'll link that down below. I think it provides some good peace of mind. A lot of the places I go don't have cell service, so if we're on a multi-day backpacking trip, we can kind of check in with home base. We can send our route, and people kind of like being able to see where we are. And by people, I mean generally my wife and the various parents that are involved in this sort of thing. And I also teach my kids how to use the SOS button. It's fairly straightforward. There's a little thing you flip off, you hold the button down, and ultimately my goal there is if I fall or hurt myself or I'm somehow incapacitated, the kids can at least summon the cavalry and hopefully get some help. Tip number 7, and again, this is arguably a bit safety related. Don't be afraid to bail. You're not out here running some sort of race. There's no trophy or demerits if you don't finish what you planned and set out to do. And ultimately you want to come home so you can live to hike or backpack or fight or whatever another day. On that note, I'll try and choose routes, particularly if we're doing something over the course of multiple days or we're going into a new area. I'll look for a route where I've got some bailing options. I'll make sure I have whatever maps I need. I'll kind of look and see where those are in relation to how many days we'll be out. So I kind of know, hey, on day 2, if we hit some rain or whatever, I've got this bail option. If we're really exhausted on day 3, I've got these couple of bail options, and here's how far they are from where we're camping or whatever. And usually I'll communicate that to my home base. I like to try and print up a map. I use an app called Gaia GPS, which I'll link to down below. And I'll highlight, here's kind of our main route, and then ideally in a different color with a little pencil or whatever, I'll highlight, here's the routes I might take if I need to bail. And you can make that decision collectively with your kids. I've had a few multi-day trips where I was kind of feeling exhausted. My son seemed right as the mail. I said, hey buddy, my feet are hurting, my knees are getting a little banged up. And he's like, yeah, I'm not feeling great either. And we kind of talked about it and collectively made the decision to bail. And yes, you as the adult have the ultimate say, but I think involving your kids in those decisions, long term makes them a better outdoors person and lets them feel like they're kind of a co-equal member of the team, which is cool for them. So last 3 tips, let's talk gear. Tip number 8 is an important one because I failed to do this recently, and that's check your kids' gear every single time, right before you go. And where I failed was we checked my son's hiking boots, everything looked great. We did that a couple weeks before we were gonna go on a little overnight backpacking trip, and he had camped the week before, and he, I don't know what he got into, but his boot had the sole starting to separate, and we were on a pretty rough section of ground with a lot of rocks, and 3/4 of the way through the first day, the sole was basically about to fall off his boot. And I noticed this, literally the morning we were leaving. I had the foresight to throw his Crocs in his pack, so we had kind of some backup shoes. We were able to get some duct tape on that sole and get another couple or 3 miles out of it, and ultimately switch to Crocs at the end of the trip. But I was kicking myself because I should have, the day before checked and said, how are his boots looking? Does he have enough socks? Does he have enough of this? Have enough of that? Because I literally, and part of the reason I was really kicking myself hard was I literally was at REI the day before, buying like some random snacks and junk. And if I had just taken the second to check his boots, I could have gotten him some shoes that wouldn't have created that stress, which mostly fell on my shoulders as the ding dong that didn't take the time to check his stuff. More generally, I'll usually give my kids a packing list and have them kind of assemble all their gear, not put it in their pack, but lay everything out, and then I'll check it over. I'll ask them, why'd you bring this? Why'd you bring that? How would you lay this out in your pack? And we'll kind of go through, why they pick certain things, why I put certain things on the list, how they're going to put them in their pack, why you might do something like put your raincoat on top over everything versus have your raincoat jammed way in the bottom. And it gives us a nice chance to have some of those kind of learning moments. Tip number 9, I'd strongly recommend getting your kids their own backpack. You don't want to use an adult backpack because packs are obviously something you want to fit well, you want to be sized to your body appropriately, and thankfully there are some good quality kids backpacks out there. I've got this one that all my kids have used, and it's kid size, it's got some adjustability, so it generally will last them from like 5 to maybe 10, 11 years old. And aside from having them have something that's comfortable, that fits them well, and ideally they had some hand in choosing, it makes them feel like they're part of the team. Even if they're carrying little more than their rock collection, their water, and a stuffed animal, at least if they've got a pack, it's like, hey, I look like dad or I look like mom, and I've got the same gear. I'm kind of a full-fledged member of this team. The one caveat I'll give you on the backpacks, other than making sure you choose a kid's one, is pick something that you as the adult can carry. If your kids are below 10, you're probably going to end up carrying that for some portion of the trip, and it could be a long portion of the trip. And what I'll do is I'll carry all the heavy stuff, and if it's a pretty flat trail where I don't need to see immediately in front of my feet, I'll just kind of wrap the straps around my front since I've got my backpack on. That's not too uncomfortable, it works reasonably well. The problem is it does sort of block your downward vision if you're on some unstable terrain. So in that case, you can either just carry it by the hang strap, which is not great, but hopefully the pack's light enough, or you might want to bring some bungees or some sort of system of carabiners or something where you can clip their backpack to yours. But do plan on having to carry it. And don't, make fun of your kids or tell them they're a wimp or whatnot. If you see them struggling, or if they're on a hard bit of terrain, or maybe they're flagging a little bit, you just say, hey, you want me to carry your pack for you? And that can kind of lighten their load and put the pet back in their step. For a lot of gear, don't fall victim. I see this particularly with people that only have one kid, to the Gucci gear syndrome. Your kids are going to grow out of it fast. Get them a good pack that fits them. Don't be afraid to buy that pack used. Look on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, hit up other outdoors people in your family that maybe have older kids. If you are going to buy something new, maybe have multiple kids, get something that you can kind of hand down through the whole cycle of children. My final tip, tip number 10, for some of the other gear, I would not get kid-specific gear. Pack-it makes a lot of sense. Kid-specific sleeping bags, for the most part that I've run across, are garbage. They're heavy, they're not well designed. An adult sleeping bag is going to last a lot longer. It's probably counterintuitively going to be lighter and of a higher quality. Things like headlamps, as long as you can cinch them up enough so they fit around a kid's head, an adult one's probably going to have more functionality. It's, again, somewhat counterintuitively probably going to be cheaper and of a higher quality. All the kind of general cookware, eating stuff, all that stuff, get them full-fledged adult gear. It's probably going to be cheaper, definitely going to be higher quality, and it's going to last them a lot longer if it's sized appropriately. The only other place where I think kids gear is relevant is probably clothing. And there, we've actually had surprisingly good luck at Walmart. A sort of lightweight fleece jacket, as long as it's not cotton or something goofy like that, is probably going to be just as good from Walmart as it is going to get the the Gucci, North Face, or the Patagonia thing that's only going to last them one season before they grow out of it. So hopefully you found these tips helpful. Again, hopefully if nothing else, this encourages you to go out, get the kids out in the woods, even if it's not the grand adventure that you've been dreaming of. Any adventure is better than not taking an adventure at all. And if these tips give you a little help, or you got some other tips or ideas, throw them down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you out there in the wilderness somewhere. And this is the Big Heavy wishing you peace and happy trails. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.